Thank you, everyone, for joining us back at the Project Censored radio show. We're very glad to be joined on the show again by Matthew Hoh, who's the Associate Director of the Eisenhower Media Network and an Emeritus Senior Fellow with the Center for International Policy. He's a disabled Marine Corps combat veteran, and in 2009, Matt resigned his post with the State Department in Afghanistan in protest over the escalation of that war. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us again.
Hi, Eleanor. It's good to see you. Thanks for having me back on.
Absolutely. So I want to start off first with something that I feel is missing from the conversation about Assange, which is the language around quote unquote classified information. Then I'll start off by saying this, that there is no law in the United States against publishing classified information. I'll say that again. There is no law in the United States against publishing classified information. And with that, Matt, can you walk us through the designation of classified materials with regards to the military, the Pentagon, and the State Department?
Yeah, sure. One of the things too is that, as my understanding of it is that as civilians, we're not bound by classified law. We're not bound by the classification process. That is something for the executive branch. They can certainly threaten us with it, and that falls underneath the Espionage Act. And I think that's why you see when a journalist like Julian Assange is prosecuted for the revelation of classified materials, it won't be on the same charges as Chelsea Manning is, or say Tom Drake was, or John Kiriakou was. Certainly there'll be some overlap, but classification pertains to the executive branch. It doesn't pertain to civilians. But that's not to say that they don't have other ways of going after people, and Julian Assange, of course, the prime example. But within the U.S. government, just as a background, I worked with classified materials for 12 years or so of my life. There's multiple levels to it. There's the sensitive but unclassified, which is called SBU. There's secret, and then there's top secret. Within top secret, there are various tranches, compartmentalized programs, if you will. So various buckets of information that people have access to. So just because you have a top secret clearance doesn't mean you could see all of the top secret information. However, if you have a secret clearance, they have changed things in the years since the Wikileaks revelations, since the work of Chelsea Manning and Ed Snowden and Julian Assange and others. You have seen where they have restricted secret access, but certainly back in my day, you could access the entire secret database of the United States government if you were on the network. It was like one big Google share drive, basically. It's basically a database. It was a lot of people too. Maybe I should stop and go back. A lot of people think that a secret or a top secret computer is special, is different, is looks like it's something from another time and dimension, and it's not. It's literally the same Windows-based machine that the rest of the government uses. You use Microsoft Office. You use Internet Explorer or whatever they're using now. That's what we're using in my day. So it's not like it's anything special or unique or custom built. What makes it secret, besides the classification process, is the connection that runs into those machines. So when you would work on these issues, you would have two computers at your desk and two screens, right? So you'd have your secret computer over here, or top secret or whatever, and then you'd have your unclassified machine here as well. Because if you needed to talk to anyone who wasn't on a network, you had to do it on the unclassified side. So, and I should say as well, with the top secret stuff, usually that is contained in a room called a SCIF, secure compartmentalized facility, and that is like a vault within a vault. So most of the time when you're working on secret or top secret programs, you're in a room that is locked, so to speak, and that's how it's handled. But it also kind of belies then the case against Julian, the case that was against Chelsea Manning, that there was hacking involved. Because if you have access to the network, okay, so if you have a secret clearance, you have access to whatever your password and your profile gets you into. And again, in the last 10 years or so, they've really limited that. But in my day, I could get on it, and it was just like getting on the internet on any machine in your house. You could travel to all these different websites hosted by all these different commands and units. You could go into their databases. Occasionally, you would come across something that was password protected, which makes sense. We do that with our work. I mean, I think most people, right? If you're working for a business or for a foundation or a firm or a company or an organization or a school or wherever, there are going to be some things that you don't want everybody to have access to. Just saw it the other day where, God bless them, they put out a great thing on Google, Google Sheets, and somebody deleted the whole thing, right? You know, so I think everyone has that experience in their life, right? So you can understand why you would just do that on a practical, we're dealing with other human beings level, but there also are, to be objective about it, security reasons why you don't want anyone. But when Chelsea provided that information to WikiLeaks, she didn't need to hack into anything. Right, it was all there, and then so that's kind of, I think, what people don't, I think helps people understand about how it all works, because I think people have in their heads a kind of a Hollywood vision of it where you have to sign in using your eyeballs, right? And there's all types of, it's like the first Mission Impossible movie where Tom Cruise comes in from the ceiling and there's lasers everywhere and they have to drug somebody to get in there and everything else, right? It's not like that. It's not like that. There certainly are secure facilities within secure facilities, but in terms of once you're on it, you're on it. And unless something is, firewalled or password protected, you could kind of see everything.
Yeah, thank you. I think very many people do have that perspective on it.
It's very mundane and boring. And I'll even tell you one thing that would this if anyone knows the U.S. government, I don't know if I've ever told this story, but like I said before, when I was in Crystal City, at that point had two computers, one unclassified, one classified, one secret level, and they were using two different Microsoft operating systems. So one was Windows 8 or whatever, and the other was Windows XP or something. I don't know. I don't remember. But I just remember everything was backwards on each of them, right? So that if anyone's worked with the U.S. government and the U.S. military, they totally understand what I'm saying. Going from one computer where the close button on your Microsoft Excel spreadsheet is in the top left to another computer where it's in the top right across from each other. That is, I think, the synthesis of the U.S. government. I think that's why a lot of us also will say that, there are conspiracies out there, certainly. The Iraq War, one of the biggest ones of all time, but many times it's more incompetence than it is conspiracy. And then sometimes, of course, it's a mix of both.
Yeah, a deadly cocktail. Yeah, well, I mean, I remember, I can't remember how old I was, but several years ago when I found out that they're still using floppy disks for our nuclear warheads. And I had to explain to someone what a floppy disk was. And I was like, okay, this is our government, right?
We had, to tell you another story from that same place, actually. This is in 2008, come into work one day, and in 2008, USB drives, very popular, right? Thumb drives, very popular. We'd had them for about 5 years or so at that point. Everyone used them for everything. And the entire Department of Defense had turned off access to thumb drives. The story was that at an overseas base, the Chinese were dropping thumb drives in the parking lots that were loaded with espionage programs. And so you're like anyone else, you're walking around, you see, oh, hey, a thumb drive, that's great. And then you go into work and you plug it in, thinking you just found yourself a brand new thumb drive. Let's see what's on it as well. Maybe there's something on there that I'm interested in, right? And what it was and so literally we came into work on a Monday, and the entire Department of Defense thumb drives have been turned off. And I always just think of like the guys, the men and women who had the big presentation that morning for the boss, and it was on the thumb drive and they couldn't do it, right? So it's comical, but it also shows the bumbling nature of it all. And so the idea that, again, to get back to the WikiLeaks story, that there had to be some type of hacking, it had to be Tom Cruise coming down from the ceiling. when no, it was, what, 20-year-old Chelsea Manning just, hooking up a hard drive in front of everybody in the office, probably downloading it all. So I think people have that appreciation, understanding of that's what the reality of this looks like. It doesn't look like a Hollywood movie. It's not the you have these very intelligence community friendly journalists and publications out there that want you to think that these dedicated public servants are at the cutting edge of and on and on and on. No, it doesn't look like that. It looks like your workplace, where most people are trying to get through the day without the place burning down.
Well, and with that, I also want to get into the other trope that's brought up with this, that because Chelsea Manning shared this classified information, and because WikiLeaks published it, there was a danger to U.S. troops and personnel. And I was wondering if you could help debunk that with your understanding and your experience with that classified information.
Well, there was never going to be that possibility, because, again, as we described, sensitive but unclassified, which is all your basic daily administrative type work. Secret is the level where harm could come to the country based upon its exposure, and top secret, to paraphrase it, dire harm could come to the country. In reality, though, the way those classifications are broken down, secret information is predominantly historical information. So what happened? A patrol went out, writes a report up, puts that up, right? The strength of units at a given point in time, right? So most of the time, your plans, the preparations for those, certainly a type of covert or clandestine operations that you are planning or running, will be on the top secret side. Your sources, any type of human intelligence, your signals intelligence, the intelligence that they get from the sensors on drones and spy planes and satellites that can detect radiation someplace or see a plume of smoke or whatnot, an exhaust, a launch type of situation. That's all on the top secret side. So once you understood that what WikiLeaks had released was secret level, there was really no possibility of harm. There was going to be no agents on there. The names of people who worked with us, whether on the intelligence side, military side, diplomatic side, were not going to be on there if there was a presumption that any harm could come to them by them being revealed. Certainly people who worked with us, that it was well known. So I say, if I'm like, when I was in Iraq or Afghanistan, and I would have a meeting with the governor or with provincial council members, or I met with this engineer, he told me about what they're building over here. The insurgency, the resistance knows who those people are. There's no, so, once you understood that this was primarily historical information, things that had happened in the past, things that were likely well known by the public in that area, and certainly by the insurgencies and the resistances in that area, where they feel the harm came from, where they say the harm comes from, is this idea that lives were put at risk. And that wasn't the case. Everything was redacted by WikiLeaks before they released it. So even once the unredacted files came out, so WikiLeaks spent a ton of time, Julian Assange led this effort, as I believe, a ton of time going through, and anyone whose name was in there, they redacted. Even though, again, as I explained, they weren't going to be in harm's way. They weren't going to be put in danger. The insurgencies, the resistances, the Al-Qaedas, the Russians, whatever boogeymen are out there, they were already aware of these people. I was going to say, so the harm that comes from that, then, I'm sorry, excuse me. So even when the unredacted versions, the WikiLeaks logs were released, those cause no problems. They cause no harm, and we know this because the United States government spent a lot of time and effort. They had a whole interagency process of going through all the WikiLeaks files. So it wasn't just the Pentagon, it wasn't just the CIA or the State Department that went through these things, but the entire government, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Labor, the Department of Agriculture, they all went through it looking for any harm, people who were hurt by these revelations. And of course, nothing was found. And we know this because the work of journalists, but also too, the US government in Chelsea Manning's trial had a say in court. We found no harm. We found nobody who was hurt by this. And then again, years later in Julian Assange's extradition trial in Britain, the same thing too. There was no evidence produced that these revelations, these exposures, these leaks caused any harm to anyone. Now, the harm it did cause was it damaged the U.S. reputation. Things were let out. Again, I said these are historical, so it's also a way of I think if looking back, you would say one of the revelations that came out that was so harmful to the American government was a revelation that prisoners were being tortured in Iraq. Particularly, the U.S. government, the U.S. military was handing over prisoners to the Iraqi government, dominated by the Shia militias at that point, who were torturing systematically those prisoners. I think people looking back would say, why didn't they put that at top secret? And looking back, I'm sure many military and intelligence and diplomats said that as well. We should have classified it differently. But I think when you're in that milieu where that environment where you don't view what you're doing as necessarily wrong, maybe it's necessary wrong, but you don't, and you're also confident it's not going to get out. You don't even think about that. And so that was the harm that came, was the revelations, particularly from diplomatic cables, of the United States's complicity, but also its actions overseas in countless countries where it was systematically violating international law, where these documents also showed that we knew that what we were doing, it was very counterproductive. That also as well, one example was the reports that came out showing that we knew the Pakistani military and the Pakistani intelligence services were supporting and funding the Afghan Taliban. So the money that we were giving to the Pakistani military and intelligence service was being pushed down to the Afghan Taliban, and they were coming and they were killing American troops in Afghanistan. And then we would send more money to the Pakistani military and intelligence services because, hey, look, the Afghan Taliban are killing our guys. We got to support the Pakistanis more, and right in that cycle, And so that type of we knew what was going on was incredibly embarrassing. So when they talk about the harm, there was harm because they were embarrassed, they were humiliated, the dirty crimes of empire were revealed. And this is ultimately why this persecution and prosecution of Julian Assange has been going on for all these years.
Yeah, I mean, as you've noted, the harm to U.S. troops seems to be the U.S. military.
Right, absolutely. Yeah.
Right. And I'm curious, because you were on the inside, and I understand that you left in 2009 before WikiLeaks released this information, but understanding that you were a part of this and the part of that system, and probably also still knew people that were a part of it, what was the response by people inside, not just like the Pentagon and the State Department, but on the ground, troops who had either done tours or were still stationed there? Was there shock? Was there disgust? Like, what was some of the because I can only speak to, and I think a lot of people can only speak to what we as civilians experienced and felt, but what was the response on the inside?
It was that, what I heard a lot from was, it was good that it was done, but it wasn't done the right way, right? So that double speak, which you often hear from people within institutions, people who are part of something they don't agree with, who they have, they're having cognitive and intellectual and moral difficulty with what's going on. And so when someone does something or something like this occurs, they support it in the sense of like, this stuff is true, it needed to be said, but it wasn't done the right way. And I heard that over and over and over again, that, not just with Chelsea, but with Ed Snowden, with Daniel Hale, it's really good that information's out there, but they didn't do it the right way. It's an excuse. It's an excuse to allow them to keep going what they're going, because we saw what happened to Ed when he tried to do it the right way. This is what Daniel Hale says. We saw what happened to Tom Drake when he tried to do it the right way. I mean, so I think that was a lot of the response. I think a lot of people who I realized that no harm's going to come from this, in the sense that our plans are going to be disrupted, or the terrorists are now going to break into an American base and steal a nuclear weapon. The way that, right, there, all the pearl clutching that was going on, right, and the hand wringing, and the was completely unnecessary. And as it was detailed, the embarrassments and humiliations came from things in the past, things that have been covered up and hidden, but certainly nothing was in jeopardy in terms of all the crimes that were in progress, if you will. And I'll refer people, actually, when you start talking about the CIA, and I guess probably the special operations community as well, you get into places where nothing is even put down. Seymour Hersh wrote about this a couple of weeks ago when he was talking about the Nord Stream bombings, how it's quite possible that whatever was written about that was written on a typewriter and then, shredded, then burned, however they get rid of it with the CIA. I mean, when it's that type of level, yeah, you're not going to have access by all these different people. And I think a lot of us too, or many of the guys I spoke with about it or talked about it, there is a feeling of comic relief, of like, of course this happened. How come it didn't happen sooner? Like in that sense, that really everything we say about ourselves, it's really just going to take a 19, 20-year-old private just to undo it all. So I think those were really responses that I recall. Certainly the higher up and the more concerned they were with their career, the more muted their opinion was. And then, of course, the U.S. government's reaction was like you would expect from a frightened beast. It overreacts. It tells anybody part of the U.S. government, you cannot read this stuff, even if it's in the USA Today, if it's in the Wall Street Journal, if CNN's on talking about it, turn off your television, because you're going to be contaminating, you're going to be guilty. And so they went on this fear campaign, and they instituted what was called the Insider Threat Program, particularly to once Ed Snowden's actions took place. And this Insider Threat Program was basically telling people, you need to rot out your colleagues. If you think someone is doing something that could put the security of this country in jeopardy, it's your responsibility to tell on that person. And so you set up this culture, right, of all right, this internal culture, this Insider Threat Program, where people were not just encouraged to rat out their coworkers, but were told it was a job duty to do so. So if this person does something wrong and we found out you didn't say anything, you're going to suffer the same consequences. And so like that type of mindset rolls throughout the whole federal government, particularly the national security side. And as far as I can understand it, it's still there to a degree, because, after Daniel Hale's and Reality Winners revelations, it just picks back up again.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of wrapping up here, I think that I remember Ed Snowden saying this, that one of his greatest fears is that nothing would change with regards to what he shared. And I think that that's a lot of people's fear as well with regards to Assange, but it goes, of course, many steps further, the effect that this would have on our access to free press, free speech, all of that. And so I'm curious how you see this having an effect on people who are either with the military, with the Pentagon, with the State Department, in terms of their ability to do what you did and have this moment where you realize, I don't actually want to be a part of this anymore. I don't think that this is right. And so I was wondering what effect do you think that will have? And also if you could share a little bit about how you came to that realization even before there were these larger leaks about what was really happening.
Well, my realization of the wars was fairly early on, but then I made excuses and I lied to myself for many years, right? I made, as we're talking, a State Department officer in the Bureau of Political and Military Affairs just resigned in protest over the Biden administration's policy of supporting Israel and its ethnic cleansing against the Gazans. And he, in his resignation letter, he speaks of the moral bargain he kept making with himself for the last 11 years in that job. And you make a bargain with yourself, you make excuses, you lie, you come up with another reason why you should persevere in this. And so the amount of mental, emotional, and spiritual trauma that whistleblowers endure before they go public often has a lifetime effect. It's so heavy on them that it's just because you've resigned in protest, you've blown the whistle, whatever. It's not, there probably some relief and maybe some pride in yourself or whatever, but that emotional, mental, and spiritual trauma still exists. And I mean, to this day, I still think certain things are going to be said about me, or people are going to come at me with certain things, call me a traitor or whatnot. And that's never happened, but still in my head. But I think, for me, the excuses were, well, I can go over there and I can do my part and I could be moral in my surroundings and my actions, and which is a foolish, naive, stupid thing to say or think, because in circumstances like war, you have no moral agency. The war makes you an agent of its immorality. That's just the way it's going to be, always has been. And then when you realize that, then it's the other excuse. Well, I'm a junior level, mid-level guy. When I'm a senior guy, I won't make the same mistakes. We need people like that to stay in so these things don't happen again. Then it becomes, well, I'm really pretty good at this job and I'm a better Marine officer than other guys. And I know if I bring these kids over there, they got a much better chance of coming back home alive than if that guy does. So it's just all these excuses, rationalizations, lies, right? And it builds and it builds. So, certainly for me, in terms of, when I spoke to the first time I ever spoke to our late friend Daniel Ellsberg, he calls me on the phone, and this was, for some reason I answered an unknown number, which would never happen now, but I did then in 2009. And it was Dan Ellsberg. And the first question he asked me was, did you bring any classified documents? And, and when I resigned, when I left Afghanistan, I was done with it. I was so morally and intellectually broken that I was done. Like, my concern was just not killing myself, honestly, at that point. It was to get away from it all, escape from it. And so I hadn't planned to do my resignation, my resigning in protest was something I thought was going to be internal. I didn't, decide to have a plan, or I never thought about speaking to the press until the head of Afghan operations for the State Department actually said that to me. Henry said, "Are you going to talk to the press?" And I had never even thought about it. And then my thoughts were, if that's the first question they're asking, they're really worried about this. So, but even if I had access to that, if I had brought back my notebooks, I burned my stuff, my personal notes, and everything before I left there. And, even if I hadn't, it would have been easy to do it. Put a thumb drive into the classified machines, would have been fine. I remember being interviewed by Jeremy Scahill for his film Dirty Wars. And he asked me a particular detail, how many people were on the JPEL. The JPEL is a Joint Prioritized Effects list. And that was the kill list that we had of who we were going to kill. And he said, how many people are on there? And I'm on film saying, I can't tell you that. Because even 9 months, 10 months after, I was still hedging. I had this thought that I would be able to go back in. There was a history of that. Tony Lake, example, someone who resigns over the Vietnam War, ends up becoming the national security advisor for Bill Clinton many, many years later. You had this idea that somehow, and maybe that's how it was then, it certainly wasn't 15 years ago, 14 years ago, certainly is not the case now. In DC now, I can't imagine how it was ever different, but it certainly is that loyalty is the most prized thing. And if I was naive, stupid, but I would hedge on those things because I didn't want to jeopardize myself So even as I was denouncing the wars and saying how the wars were counterproductive and the Obama surge in Afghanistan was doomed for failure, and and then on with Libya and Syria and everything else, I, at that point was afraid to, put forward anything that I knew was classified. Now, of course, I would tell you, if I remember right, about 3,000 people on that list, right? And just one of those things, another little story, I had to go to NATO headquarters, ISAF headquarters in Kabul one time when I was there with several other guys. And our point in visiting them was to talk to them, how do we get people off of the JPEL? So to get somebody onto that kill list, where either a drone would come in, an F-15 or B-1 or whatever would drop a bomb on your house, or our commandos would come and kick your door down and shoot you in the face, we could get you on that list, no problem. If I wanted to, I could have, anyone who was in a position to do so could do so. That person needs to go on the list, and he would go on the list. Get a person off the list was impossible. And I'm not joking about impossible. There was not a way to get somebody off the list. So I remember going to this meeting where it was a scene out of a movie. It was this absurd Kafka-esque situation. Very catch-22, where you could put someone on a list, but you can't take them off. Right? You can get the person killed, but you can't keep them from being killed, even if you're there with all your documentation and everything else saying that's the wrong guy, that's the wrong person. And of course, people probably recall that's how our no-fly list was in the United States. It probably may still be. We had tens of thousands of people on no-fly lists, and almost all of them had no reason to be there. Literally, almost all of them. And when people found out they were on, they couldn't get off. Right? I mean, so you have this type of my libertarian friends are going to be cheering me on if they hear this, right? This type of this type of bureaucratic inertia, this absurdity, again, this Kafka-esque type of thing that you look at it and you say, my God. And then I think a lot of that builds up as well too, in your head when you're going through this, when you're having these intellectual and moral problems with what you're taking part in. You see the ridiculousness of the institutions, and they can accomplish getting people killed, but we don't even know if we're killing the right people. And I mean, so that was the type of things that you saw over and over again. So even knowing the absurdity of that, right, that whole story I just spoke about there, when Jeremy Scahill asked me how many people were on the list, I still told him I couldn't tell him. Right. I mean, so even after I resigned, after, everything else, and it took me a couple of years to get past that. And now, certainly, yeah, absolutely. Of course, I wish I had taken stuff with me. I wish when Dan had called me that first time, and Dan Ellsberg called me that first time, I've been like, yeah, I've got a whole briefcase full of it. What should I do with it? I wish that was the case, but.
Well, I think regardless of briefcases full of thumb drives, I think that you do a very powerful and important job now of speaking out against the military-industrial complex and the U.S. empire. And I think it's why people come to you, because it's not that common to find someone who was in the Marines and worked for the State Department that is now in your position. And for me, that's one of the things that I hear Snowden's words in my head, like we need more people like you and veterans that are for peace to bring people who have served to out of the machine. Because somebody like me, I've known people in the military who have looked at me in the face and just said, you don't understand and you'll never understand. So I can't reach them. But having people who have been in those situations and had those jobs and seen the things that you've seen, I think is so important for reaching the people who are in those positions now.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. And I'm sorry that's been your experience trying to talk to people from the military or intelligence community or diplomatic corps or whatever, because it's a really lazy, shallow, nonsensical excuse not to engage on something, right? It's a means of avoiding something that you don't want to take it on. So you just immediately discredit whatever's being said from whoever's saying it as they couldn't understand. They don't understand. And the reality is I was fairly unique in my experiences, that I had a pretty broad range of experiences, very low level work to very senior work, but oftentimes it's as a bump on the log, right? As just, Forrest Gump myself into that circumstance where I'm around these senior people, but at the same time too, having that experience of being on the ground, right? Being in, people's homes, being in, local council meetings, like seeing from the population side as well. And most men and women who are there oftentimes have a very narrow aperture, right? They're looking through the soda straw, so to speak, because they have a job that's very confined. And this is why my friend Danny Davis, when he came forward in 2012, January 2012, the New York Times put him on the front page when he went to Congress with classified information, which you are allowed to do under law. And Danny spent a lot of times making sure he didn't break the law in order to do this. He went to Congress with the classified information, and Danny said, look, General Petraeus and others are coming in here and they are saying this about Afghanistan, and that's not true. This is what their own internal information says. They are coming in here and they are lying to you. It says A, and they are coming in and they're saying X. And Danny will tell you about 6 members of Congress looked at what he provided, and they were the usual suspects: Walter Jones, Barbara Lee, so I think there's that frustration as well. There's such capture of the media and the political spectrum by the military industrial complex, including the intelligence agencies, that you have to resort to the spectacular, the dramatic, to getting attention, right? So if Daniel Hale tries to do it the right way, rather than putting out videos of drones killing innocent people, you don't have that, again, the drama of it, the theater of it, then no one's going to pay attention to Daniel. If it wasn't for the spectacle of Donald Trump himself, we probably wouldn't know much about Reality Winner. And Reality Winner's story is so dominated just by Trump, right? If she had put out something unrelated to Trump, it wouldn't have made much of notice, and they still would have thrown her in jail, by the way.
Yeah, as we've been discussing, the empire does not like to be made a fool and have its own facts thrown back in its face. Matthew, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us and share your insight. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for doing this, and thank you for the work you do.